Time to take a deep dive into a black hole. I want to go in depth into the world of black miniature paint. Oddly enough, we only really get exposed to one type of black paint as miniature painters. It doesn't matter which company either, GW, Vallejo, Army Painter, Scale 75. There's almost 100% chance that if you're buying something that has black on the label in a miniature paint line, it's going to be a carbon black. So in this video, I want to explore all the possibilities of black paint out there, discover new ones, and of course paint with them. Starting with Carbon Black, PBK7. Almost every black paint you get from paint lines dedicated to miniatures is going to be a carbon or lamp black pigment. And there's nothing wrong with that at all, it's a good black pigment. But the main two things to know about it are that it has a high tinting strength and it's blue shifted, which I'll get into in a bit. As far as all the differences goes between all these carbon blacks though, is going to be the pigment load, binder, and finish. For pigment load, that determines how dense the pigments are within the black, thus how opaque. For something like this Chimera color, it's been loaded with so much pigment that it'll cover almost anything in one coat, whereas a black ink is meant for being a bit more transparent. Binders usually only come in a couple of forms in miniature paints, and that's a fluid acrylic or a heavy body. Either can be thinned with water, so don't make too much of a difference, but they can also have additives, making them useful as primers as well, and to also determine the finish. Speaking of finish, that'll probably be the main thing that most people will prefer one over another for. Most game color lines like GW, Army Painter, Vallejo Game Color, and Fantasy and Games from Scale 75 are satin, which means they'll have a bit of a gloss shine to them, while Scale Color, Chimera Color, and Model Colors will be more matte, which help them appear darker. Ivory Black, pigment code PBK9, or the black we don't know about. Just because carbon black is the most common, doesn't mean it's the only one. In the artist's world, there's carbon black, but also Mars black, ivory black, and even chromatic black, which I'll get into in a bit. For right now, I want to talk about the difference between carbon black and ivory black. Pigments have what's called a tinting strength, and basically refers to how much you need of a pigment in order to change it more towards that color. So in the case of these blues, the same amount of phthalo blue into white will remain more vibrant, while the exact same amount of ultramarine blue barely changes it at all. Therefore, phthalo blue has a higher tinting strength than the ultramarine. Now that we know the principle of tinting strength, I can reveal that carbon black actually has a very high tinting strength. A 50-50 mix of carbon black in anything will turn it really dark, even white. Ivory black, in turn, actually has a really low tinting strength. Here's the same amount into white for comparison. So why does this matter? Well, let's say you wanted to wet blend from a black to a lighter color. Colors with carbon black are always going to mix towards the darker shade, whereas something with an ivory black will be more subtle in the shift. It also means when mixing, you can add black to colors gradually, potentially making them less muddy or your steps between shades more gradual. Why we don't see ivory black in more miniature paint lines, I don't know. I mean, it would be nice to have it marketed as, say, a blending black or a mixing black. I mean, I've been painting for 20 years, and even I've only figured out about this recently. Chromatic Black, the black you make for yourself. The last paint we should know about is a chromatic black. And while it's not a paint you'll find in any bottle or pot, it's one we should no less know about as painters. If you take all your primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, and mix them together, you get something horribly muddy, but theoretically they neutralize each other and give you something like a black. Secondary colors are what you get if you mix primary colors, but those colors also exist naturally as single pigments. So if you mix a green into a red, you technically have all three primary colors, which once again should give you a black. Or if you mix all the secondaries together. This is the essence of a chromatic black, using colors opposing on the color wheel to make a black. In practice though, it means you can take pigments that already start pretty dark and use them to make a black. A common one is dark blue into a dark brown, though in the case of miniature paints, a lot of browns tend to already have black pigment mixed in. But it will still give a nice dark shade. And another easy one is a phthalo green with a primary red. Orange, purple, and green can all start very dark to give nice dark shades too. So why would we use a chromatic black over just a black paint? Well, black pigment has its own color, and I mentioned this earlier when I said that carbon black was blue shifted. And we all know this because if you mix a black into yellow, we end up with a green. This goes for both ivory and carbon black. With a chromatic black, you get to choose which direction to shift it. If you want a warmer black, more brown or orange or red into a chromatic mix can give you that, meaning once you mix it with yellow, instead of a green, you get more of a mustard. Because this form of black is made out of actual colors, it will appear less dirty than a pure black when used to shade or mix. It can also matter when you start mixing in white to start getting your grays for highlights. By just changing your chroma around from more blue to more red, you can get very different looks for things that are meant to represent black in our miniatures. So now that we have a more in-depth understanding about the black paints that we knew about and the ones that we didn't, what do we do with that knowledge? Well, we paint miniatures, of course, and since black is one of those ones that I know people have a hard time with, I'm going to paint a single miniature with all 3 black paints I just showed you. That way, hopefully you'll get the most out of your dark color schemes. For the model, I'm going to use the Duchies of Vinci Alchemist. Sans feather though, because I accidentally broke mine off. I could use one painted up for my warband, and his Plague Doctor style, along with a bit of object source lighting, is just begging to be painted black. I'm going to start with a bit of mood lighting. I know I want the flame from his lantern to be a light source object, so using my airbrush, I'm going to outline the area where the light is going to reach. I use my paint pretty thin in my airbrushes, so it's going to take a lot of layers, but basically, I just spray it everywhere I think the light can get to. This is a mix of pure red and red oxide. So this will be the first use of black, using Ivory Black as a subtle way to shade some of the parts the light shouldn't be catching. I do a form of wet blending called loaded brush by adding my red to the brush and then just dabbing the tip into the Ivory Black. Because it has a low tinting strength, you can actually have quite a lot on the tip and it won't affect it too much. So it is a pretty foolproof black for doing this compared to a carbon black. I also use it to kind of fade out the light towards the bottom of pouches like this one. I'll use some of the Ivory Black to mix into a white for a nice neutral gray. Because red's my base color, instead of adding white to the red to highlight, I'm going to add white to the model and instead glaze the red over it, keeping its nice red color, but the white underneath making it more vibrant. Because I want the flame to be the most light, that's why I'm using a gray, glazing over the parts I highlighted with a red a few times until I'm happy with the color. For the flames to be brighter, I'm using pure white as a base, and filling out the tips of the flames pretty solidly with it. Then I do a pure red glaze, but keep it light, so that as I do a few more layers of the glaze, I can target it away from the tips so that they stay a bit lighter without being pink, while the red towards the base of the flames is a more solid red. For his overcoat, I want to whip up a batch of Chromatic Black, and since I wanted a little purple shifted, I'll be using green, orange, and purple for it, just mixing some of each in at a time until I get the right kind of color I want. Then I just do an overall base layer for it, and when I start getting near the red I've already done, I'll thin it out with some water into a glaze and just slightly go into the red a bit with it. That way, I get a little transition between the colors. For the highlights, I just add a bit of white into my black mix, and when I mean a bit, I mean a tiny bit. If it seems like too much, I'll add some more of the base. Then with this mix, I'll start to layer onto the folds of the cloth pretty roughly. Even with a slight change in the mix, it still sticks out pretty blatantly, but I'll be fixing that in the next step. Once all those rough highlights have dried, I'm going to just do another base coat of my Chromatic Black. It's diluted out a bit, but not really all that much. But as you can see, when it dries, you can still see that layer underneath. So what this is doing is bringing down the brightness as well as blending out the edges a bit between those shades and highlights. I'll do one more shade color now, but I add a bit more green to the purple shifted base mix in order to bring it more towards a pure black. Then with this glaze, only hit the recesses of the cloth folds. It'll make them just a little bit darker, but also blend out those edges where the light and the dark meet just that little bit more. Going back to my first highlight color, I'll thin it out with a little bit of extra green added, and more water, then wick out most of it onto a paper towel. I'll use this to glaze some of the lighter shades back into the lightest points, just where I think the light will catch the cloth the most, like on his shoulders and raised ridges. Then, with just a little more white added to that wet mix, pick out edge highlights. On the lower half, there's lots of patterns and lines, so I edge highlight those. But on the shoulders, where it's more of a hill than an edge, I stipple a pattern onto it just to push that bit of contrast and get a nice texture. For the last black, it'll be the one we're all used to. I'm going to do his hat and boots with it, starting by just adding a bit of white, not a whole lot at all. But as you can see, when I paint it over, it translates into actually being quite a lot. But don't worry, with this one, I'm going to be doing the same as the Chromatic Black. Carbon black may have a pretty high tinting strength, but thinned to a glaze, it can actually be very transparent and easy to work with. So I'm not too cautious where this glaze goes really, just using it to blend the points where the primer and the dark gray I did meet. Adding a bit more white to the base dark gray, I add a lot of water and then wick it out onto a paper towel. Putting white on black when you're trying to go dark, you can end up easily sabotaging yourself and go too bright. By keeping the gray thin, it forces me to layer gradually, just with a bit of stippling towards the points of the hat and the rims where I'd pick up the most light. For the last little bit of this, I'll add just a tiny bit more white and wick it away again, then just stipple the very edges and tip for a bit of texture and my brightest highlights. So there we have it, carbon black, ivory black, and a chromatic black all used on the same model for different effect between each having its own good reason for being there. And while I don't expect everyone to go rushing out to buy some ivory black anytime soon, or mixing up their own chromatic blacks when you're just trying to get an army done, I still think it's important that we know our options. That way, as you learn and develop, you can figure out exactly what works best for you. I can share my knowledge, but I never want to tell anyone what they should do with it. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one, or just other fun things to do with painting miniatures. And until next time, enjoy your own painting journey.